It is my pleasure to introduce Shanie Reichman, Haisam Hassanein, and Faris Almaari, who are our wonderful speakers tonight. We are so grateful to have you here with IPF in this partnership.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Brooklyn. And thank you, Central Synagogue. And thanks, everyone here, for joining us for what will be a very critical discussion, I think very timely, about normalization between Israel and its Arab neighbors, both its neighbors and its over-the-river neighbors. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives and IPF ATID at Israel Policy Forum, and we're very excited to be partnering with Central Synagogue, a synagogue that we work with very, very often and are really thrilled to be back. Over the past several years, we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts when it comes to Israel and its neighbors, obviously the Abraham Accords, but other ongoing security and economic partnerships. And I think normalization remains very complex, and it's shaped by public sentiments on the ground in these countries. It's shaped by ever-changing security threats, and of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today, we're going to explore what drives normalization, what limits it, and if it can, whether or not, and the answer may be different for both of you, whether or not it can withstand escalating regional tensions, especially the ongoing war in Gaza. To help us navigate these issues, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Haisam Hassanein, an adjunct fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Faris Almaari, an analyst at Horizon Engage, currently a scholar at SAIS, focused on security and strategy in the US and the Middle East. Okay. You can obviously both answer all questions, but I will somewhat direct each of them to either of you based on the topic. The first one to you, Haisam. Egypt and Jordan signed peace agreements with Israel many decades ago. How have those peace agreements evolved over time? What do public sentiments look like on the ground in those countries vis-a-vis Israel? Has any of that changed since October 7th? And where do you see points of contention between Israel and Egypt and Jordan, and what does the future look like?
Thanks for having us, and a pleasure to meet all of you tonight. I think the peace deal between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel was a milestone in Middle East history, because after years of bloodshed and conflicts, it brought comfort in the region for the people over there to stop that. And then through their governments, the courageous leaders of the governments back then. When you talk to many, I'm Egyptian, and when you talk to many Egyptians who witnessed the war times in the 60s and the 70s, everybody remembers fondly the transition the country started to go through by the late 70s and early 80s after the peace deal that President Sadat signed. Economically speaking and socially speaking, the country started to witness lots of changes, which was a positive step for many people who suffered, because many of the government resources was allocated toward the conflict. And I think this led to, and I consider it one of the most successful things of the peace deal between Egypt and Israel, something called the QIZ, the Qualifying Industrial Zones. It was an American-sponsored deal in the early 2000s that told the Egyptian side, if you want access, free access to the American market, you have to do deal with your Israeli partners on the opposite side. So till today, you have lots of Egyptian businessmen alongside their Israeli counterparts. They cooperate in such business deals, mainly in the clothing sector, and then they export that to the American market closely. Millions of dollars is in that, and hundreds of thousands of Egyptian families are living off that. And I think this is one of the greatest things. And the Jordanian case also as well, it's an example of a country that has lots of people of Palestinian origins and signed peace deal with Israel, and for almost few decades now, the peace has been sustained despite the ups and downs in the relationship. If we're going to look at it from a positive perspective, obviously it has also its own downs, but also lots of economic deals. And I still remember when I used to live in Israel, I used to be invited yearly to an institute called Arava Institute. If you heard about that, it's an environment institute. And to my surprise, I met many Jordanians who used to come to Israel on yearly basis, study alongside their Israeli counterparts, Arab Israeli and Jewish Israelis, study about issues related to agriculture, issues related to environment, and how can they fix things in the Middle East to the better. So there is a positive, just a positive note, and I will elaborate more, but just leave it for now.
Faris, if you have anything, yeah. Faris, if you have anything to add, you're welcome to. But I'll tack onto the question, my Saudi-focused question. Before October 7th, I think a lot of us who are connected to Israel were kind of excited, thinking about prospects for normalization with Saudi Arabia, which has broadly been perceived as the crown jewel, and one that will open the door to normalization with many other countries, maybe the entire Middle East, right? Except for a few, right? And I think that a lot of the hope for that was shattered. There is speculation that part of what motivated Hamas on 10/7 was the prospects of Saudi normalization. And there's also speculation now that it's nearly impossible, given the current situation in the Gaza Strip. So I'm curious where your thoughts are on prospects for normalization. Would it actually open the door across the Middle East? And what are the different dynamics that come to play? So economic, security, diplomatic, political, what is influencing this? And this is sort of a question for both of you in the sense that public sentiment is important, but less important in monarchies, frankly. So these aren't democratically elected governments. So to what extent is the public sentiment on the ground influencing what's actually happening at the leadership level?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm flattered and I'm honored to be here and speak to you all and being hosted by the IPF. Short answer to public sentiment, it does matter a lot, even in authoritarian regimes and monarchies. In almost every country, public sentiment matters a lot, and this is a major driver in Saudi Arabia and in a lot of Arab states. But again, I want to touch on what Haisam said. The history of Egypt and Jordan is different than the history of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. As you said, it doesn't border Israel. Saudi Arabia has never had a direct conflict with Israel. It did participated in all the major Arab-Israeli wars by sending troops to be under the command of Egyptian, Iraqi, Jordanian commanders. So there's a little bit of differences, and the history of conflict is just a little bit different. But however, Saudi Arabia have always been a major supporter of the Palestinians. And Ibn Saud, for example, King Abdulaziz, during his meeting with FDR, 1945, stressed the idea of Palestinian and like the Jewish migration to Palestine, and also Palestinian statehood. So again, you can trace history and see how the public sentiment matters a lot in terms of for normalization, and still does today. If you look at polls, for example, the Fikra Forum does a lot of polling in Saudi Arabia, and you can see major support for Palestinian. It fluctuates sometimes depending on circumstances, but it is there. But again, normalization, despite all of that, despite support for Palestinian statehood, for Palestinian cause, there's a lot of hope for normalization pre-October 7. We don't know if Hamas actually, I know there's a lot of speculation whether Hamas made the attack and attacked Israel on October 7 just to spoil the normalization prospects between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But I think the scale and of the attack requires a lot more planning, and it's just the time frame to me doesn't add up. However, so before October 7, we've seen this really, Saudi, Israel, the United States were about to sign this mega trilateral agreement where the United States would, give Saudi Arabia a defense or like a defense commitments or a defense treaty. So both would sign kind of like an Article 5 defense treaty, in addition to help with Saudi Arabia's nuclear civilian nuclear program, and among other things, in exchange for Saudi Arabia normalizing relation with Israel without, at some point, it was without a Palestinian statehood. The language was with a credible path toward a Palestinian statehood. This all changed after October 7th. And this is why, it's, as you said, it's nearly impossible. Now we see normalization now because the political environment in Israel and no one talks about the two-state solution anymore. It has become a taboo, basically. No one wants even to say the words. And for Saudi, with the destruction in Gaza and with the massive the scale of the attacks and the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, it became really hard to justify any deal with the current Israeli government, in my opinion. And this is why we think, again, back to the idea of public opinion, and not just that, it's even Saudi leaders, and you always hear in policy circles that Saudi leaders, or Arab leaders in general, just Saudis, don't really care about the Palestinian cause, and they might just say things in public to appease their constituency or their populations. But I've heard a lot of diplomats who worked in Saudi and talking about it is actually true. I mean, even like leaders on the top, the most senior level, really do care about the Palestinian cause. And so you have the leaders who are really looking at what's happening in Gaza, and the public as well. It becomes really hard to conceive normalization going forward unless Israel does like a massive U-turn, basically, on everything happening right now in Gaza. So, in short, and we can touch later on this potential security, economic benefits of normalization. But as of now, normalization seems really, really out of reach. And yeah, I think I'll leave that for now.
I think, if I may, I'm going to be a little bit optimistic. I think normalization could be reached, but it will depend on how the current administration in Washington going to approach the Saudis and what's going to be offered on the table when it comes to the conversation between President Trump and the Saudi leadership. And just to give you a little bit of context, historically, the Saudis have been pro the Palestinian cause, as Faris has said, but in the past decade, we started to have a change of dynamics in the Arab world when it comes to who is assuming the top leadership. And I think the Saudis started to be at the helm of that. And to be at the helm of that, the Palestinian, in my humble view, the Palestinian issue started not to be the main focus as a top leader of the region, because they started to look around them in the Arab world. There are many issues happening. The Iranian issue, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the radicalization and extremism of ISIS, and the many economic problems that are sweeping across the region. And then you have a new young leadership came to Saudi Arabia in the past 10 years with aspirations for the country in the world stage and as the new leaders in the Arab world. And I think this placed the Palestinian question in a secondary or a third place position. Yes, October 7th brought it back to the picture, but in my humble opinion, if there is going to be deals between Washington and Riyadh that is going to serve the interests of Riyadh in a very drastic way, I think they wouldn't focus much on, they will still consider it, but normalization will not be seized or will not be postponed till till Hamas is being taken care of, or the Palestinian society is working on its own issues and be ready to sign a peace deal with the Israeli side.
May I add something? just want to add something quick in here. I think I agree with you on a couple of points. To me, I think when I think of a normalization deal right now under the Trump administration, first of all, Biden administration approach was all about a trilateral agreement between Israel, United States, and Saudi Arabia. He didn't want to go forward with a bilateral deal with Saudi Arabia unless Israel was involved. It would be interesting to see what Trump administration would do. Will they, would the Saudis convince the Trump administration to go forward with a deal, or maybe Trump administration would convince Saudi Arabia also to go forward with for a bilateral deal without involving Israel. So I think that's the one of the major factors in our assessment when it comes to normalization. How would Trump deal with Saudi Arabia differently than Biden? Would it be trilateral or would it be bilateral? Because, in my opinion, Trump is more transactional, and this is why I think Trump might, as you said, Saudi domestic politics is a priority right now for the current leadership. And if Trump sees a benefit from just having a deal with Saudi Arabia and in exchange for investments in the states in return for other commitments from the United States to Saudi, that's why I think there could be a deal with the United States with that normalization. But again, we still haven't seen clearly the Trump approach yet.
And I think one last point, it's not a point, it's a question. A question we should be thinking about. Also, we talk about normalization, but also we have to talk about the perception in the Arab world when it comes to the Palestine question after October 7th and before October 7th. And if there is really hope in the Arab world that Palestinians could unify and have one word so they could come on the table and sit and then negotiate for a state for themselves. So I think this has been very frustrating before October 7th, and I think it will be more frustrating after October 7th because once Israel leaves Gaza, there is going to be many factions of Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip. Yes, Hamas is trying to take control, but it got weaker and it will get weaker. So I think this is a challenge. The more divisions among Palestinians, the more frustrated the outside Arab world will be, especially the ones that really futurist and would like to see themselves moving quickly and accomplish things in a very quick way for their own people and for the entire region.
On that note, in terms of the future for Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general, before October 7th, there was obviously this illusion of a status quo, certainly in Israeli society, but maybe even amongst many of these Arab countries. I would say perhaps less in Egypt and Jordan, but at least in the Gulf, there was some sort of perception that the status quo was somewhat sustainable. And this was, of course, shattered on October 7th. I'm wondering where they see the future of this conflict going, in their most optimistic sense, and also what would they settle for. Egypt has played an interesting role, productive at times, less productive at other times, in alleviating the conflict. They've had a very, I would say, unique role to play because they obviously contribute to the blockade of the Gaza Strip over many years. They played, I would say, I don't want to be too rude, but accepting $10,000 to accept Gazan refugees, right? A lot of controversial pieces with the role that Egypt has played, which I know you have a lot to say on too. So I'm curious what role you see Egypt as playing in all of this. We can get to Jordan too, but obviously if there's any future here, it has to be, it has to be not just Israel involved, but Egypt and Jordan as the other borders have a lot to do here. And then I'm curious, I would presume that Saudi Arabia folks at the leadership and public level have a very different approach because they're frankly have a lot of more distance from Palestine. So I'm curious, Haisam, for you to start, and then we'll hear how that differs from where the Saudis are at on this.
So to give the audience some context, in the past 10 years, let's put it this way, when an American president used to arrive to the White House 20 years ago, one of the first countries he would be calling was, the capitals would be Cairo, and this shows that the role that Egypt used to play in Arab politics and Middle Eastern politics at the time, 20 years ago. This started to diminish in the past decade after the Arab Spring, because economic problems, social problems, and also the rise of young Arab leaders in Gulf countries that are supported by technology and money and can really make things happen in a quick way. And as they say, as we were talking about the Faris, it's the moment of the Gulf, So October 7th crisis reinvented the status of Egypt in the Arab world, because Egypt borders Gaza. Egypt, whatever is going to happen to Gaza or whatever it's happening now, construction-wise, it's going to be Egypt as a bordering country taking care of that. So lots of Egyptian contractors are, let's call it, as ironic as it may sound, excited about the potentials of Gaza reconstructions. Many of them come from military background, so either they are going to be retiring or they are leaving their jobs intentionally and creating their own business companies so they can have their own contractors and go reconstruct Gaza. Billions of dollars are going to be poured on that. So this is going to benefit the Egyptian economy. Also, when it comes to Egyptian diplomacy, as I mentioned, before October 7th, Egypt was struggling with its conflict with Ethiopia because of the Nile water. The Palestine question was not really the focal one in the region, because everybody was focusing on the Iranian deal or the conflict between Israel and Iran or the Saudis and the Houthis or the rise of the new Gulf leaders with their aspirations to transform the region. So October 7th reinvented the status of Cairo and made it an interesting player in Middle Eastern politics. But the question is, are they going to seize the moment and make also good decisions that really could enhance their image or enhance the role and contribute to their effectiveness in the conflict or not? Because so far we will see, yes, they are going to play when it comes to reconstruction, but what about when it comes to managing local politics inside Gaza? What about when it comes to controlling the rise of Hamas and other jihadist groups? What about contributing to normalizations with Israel? Because this is an issue, needs lots of homework, because two countries have been signing peace deals for more than 40 years, and still people-to-people peace has not been as it used to, has not fulfilled its potentials. But on the positive note, the economic side keeps growing. As I mentioned, the QIZ, the qualifying industrial zones, and the natural gas deals as well. But lots of homework is needed on the Egypt-Israel side.
So I think there are two folds in my answer. So the first one, the Gulf, and then the Saudi aspect. The reason I say this because the Gulf is not a monolith. There are different policies and different approaches, between Qatar, the Emirates, and Saudi. So in terms of Gaza and the way the Gulf views it, again, it's different. The Emirates might have a different view of what they want to see in Gaza, or different from Saudi and Qatar, for example. For Saudi Arabia, I think the way I see it, the main goal or the main thing that they want to do or they want to achieve is trying to support Egypt and Jordan in what is coming next. Basically, because Jordan and Egypt are the countries that are bordering Gaza, there is, as you said, it allowed, Egypt has been its role has been revamped again in the region, and so Saudi wants now to I don't want to say delegate, but basically support Egypt in whatever is going to happen. Reconstruction efforts, funding, that's mostly going to come from the Gulf and hopefully European partners as well. But I think the main view is what to do, with all the Palestinians in Gaza there, and how would that impact the Egyptian economy, how would that impact the Jordanian economy, because these both countries are to the Gulf, or the stability of these countries is extremely important, and so it's supporting them and trying to stabilize and come up with a plan, basically, that doesn't negatively impact those countries. Is probably that's how the Gulf and Saudi in particular view Gaza. So it's not about Gaza itself, because what Saudi can do in Gaza, I think, is limited. It's just simply because of geography, but it's what to do and how to help Egypt and Jordan.
May I add one thing? I think I agree with Faris, but one thing we have to be careful with. First of all, let's explain this way. The rise of Saudis in the past decade has been making the Egyptians uncomfortable, and the Saudis also has been careful with not antagonizing the rulers of the past. You know, I'll just give you an example. When it comes to Ramadan TV shows, you know, so what the Saudis started to do, Ramadan TV shows is a big thing in the Arab world, and the country that used to dominate that in the past used to be Egypt. But recently, Saudis also started to get into the media industry of the Arab world, and they are trying to shape that. So you'll always see that the Saudi minister who is managing that is always hosting Egyptian sides on TV live and assuring the Egyptian public that this is not going to be coming at the expense of the Egyptian hegemony in the media. So why I'm using that to reference to a very important point. So I agree that the Saudis are supporting the Jordanians and the Egyptians, but they should be careful, not the Saudis, Saudis and the US when it comes to these issues, that not to give them the upper hands when it comes to managing these profiles 100%. You know, there has to be some opinions injected from the Saudis, which is with directives, you know, and with yeah. So that's basically the point. Don't let them control things 100%, and the Saudis have to have a say on things because also they are paying money on that and funding things.
So I think just a very quick point. I think you're absolutely right. That's that's what I assume you know, leaders, decision makers are thinking about right now in Saudi. The old policy of giving a blank check to the Arab states, the Muslim Islamic states, is just not, you know, is no more. Saudi is done with trying to prop up, you know, all these governments and just giving them whatever funds they need, and so the idea of like any funds coming, you know, that will be allocated to Gaza or like through Egypt or through Jordan, I don't know how this will, you know, how will this happen, but any funds that will go to the reconstruction of Gaza will come with a lot of conditions. And a lot, you know, I don't know how to describe it probably. Is it directives or is it conditions? But there will be a lot of you know, strings attached to any funding going forward. So, and this again ties to the idea that we've touched on very briefly to the rise of the Gulf as the center of power in the Middle East. And you know, we've talked about it in the past. The Levant, Iraq, Egypt used to be the center of power. All those countries, Iraq is, you know, is fragmented. Politically speaking, maybe, and Syria is also, you know, just got out of a civil war, and Egypt is not what it used to be. So the Gulf and Saudi Arabia do have a lot more influence than what they used to have over, you know, Jordan, over Egypt, I would say. So I think the idea is supporting them is not that to give them whatever they think they need and whatever they ask for, but the idea is to just keep the problem at bay, or at least try to keep the problem from not getting worse. So that's what I think the minimum would be, you know, the idea of aid to Jordan and Egypt in terms of Gaza.
Looking back to the reconstruction of Gaza conversation, Israel Policy Forum is an organization that very early on in the war produced recommendations for a day after strategy. It's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'm sure both of you do as well. It's clear to me that if there is to be an effective strategy of reconstructing Gaza, it will include Egypt, it will include Jordan, Saudi, and a variety of actors in the region, right? And it won't just require billions of dollars, it'll also require manpower, it will require quite a lot. Presumably, they are not, any of these countries, really any country across the Arab world, is not interested in funding and investing in the IDF, you know, monitoring Gaza indefinitely, right? So presumably there will be some sort of shift in leadership. What would that look like to get Egypt, Jordan, Saudi, and others invested in moving us forward, right? Because there needs to be a day after strategy that is able to engage all these countries with or without normalization. What would such a plan look like? Is it clear to you what that would look? To me, it feels as though it would require at the probably Palestinian Authority in some form involved, and a variety of other requirements. But I'm curious what you think from the Egyptian and the Saudi side, and feel free to add in other countries as well.
So I wouldn't speculate a lot on what to do with the Palestinian Authority. I do indeed agree that there needs to be a lot of reform. And this has been a major constraint, a major obstacle for funding to the Palestinian Authority. So that's 100% yes.
And I'll interrupt you to pitch that Israel Policy Forum has a report specifically on reforms for the Palestinian Authority from the Israeli angle, Palestinian angle, American angle. So you should all read it.
Absolutely. So that's one I totally agree with. But also, what can the U.S. do and what can to bring in all those countries to work together? I frankly don't know. I don't know if there is a will, like a strong will to I'm sure there are a lot of diplomatic efforts right now on the day after, the reconstruction plans, and we have the Egyptian plan and there's the American plan and all these different plans, and I think the Emiratis have some proposals or some reservations on some of the plans. To me, is the first step forward right now is just to agree to what's going to happen. And before that, are the Palestinians in Gaza going to stay there? And even before that, when will Israel stop bombing Gaza? Because all these discussions of those plans is important. We should, highlight them. But honestly, they don't matter as long as Israel continues to bomb Gaza. So the day after, and what can we do and what can the U.S. do to bring all those countries is honestly just pressuring Israel to play ball, to stop, to just try to de-escalate the conflict. I personally can't see what other objectives that other than the hostages, of course, which were about all to return until the ceasefire ended. I didn't really see what other objectives that Israel still has to achieve in Gaza. There is nothing left to bomb. So, I need to think about this more. But as of now, I just think first de-escalation. Second, I just agree. Are you going to keep the Palestinians in Gaza? Are you going to move them? Where are you going to move them? What are you going to do exactly with them? Because I think countries are just all those countries you've mentioned. They're trying to come to a consensus, and I think, to me, it seems there's none yet. So,
I do think they may go hand in hand, right? A ceasefire deal that develops the contours of a day after plan can often be constructed together.
I think also an important question should be asked: what's the future of Hamas inside Gaza after Israel leaves and decides not to go back? So because there's going to be a vacuum left in Gaza. So what are we going to do with Hamas? And also in the West Bank as well. Yes, there have been talks about reforms of the Palestinian Authority, but Egypt also started to train, and I think the Jordanians as well, train some members of the Palestinian Authority to be police officers inside the Gaza Strip. But what I worry the most about is the rise of Hamas inside the West Bank itself, the Palestinian Authority territory. So I think this is another question, another challenge, another question we should think about it. But I think for now, the main question should be is, if Israel leaves and the conflict stops, there is going to be a vacuum. What is the future of Hamas and other jihadist groups? This is number one. Number two, also, the Palestinian society is going to be left or already actually traumatized because of what has been happening to them since October 7th. So this means is recruitments by extremist groups inside the Strip is going to get increased. And actually, we started to witness that. While Hamas lost lots of its fighters for Israel, they started also to go and target the young kids in the Gaza Strip nowadays, they have no house, they have nothing to do, and they say, hey, I will give you a rifle and join us, and you will have a salary, you know. So also this is another challenge. And another challenge also should be thinking about it when it comes to reconstruction of Gaza and the contractors, as I said, from the Egyptian side, from the Jordanian side, and also remember there is going to be lots of contractors from Gaza who are going to be making millions of dollars because of that. What I worry about is, what is the affiliation of these contractors? Are they Hamas affiliates, or are just Palestinian who are not affiliated with anybody else? So I think this question has to be thought of. So for me, whenever I think about the future of Gaza, I think about how do we ensure that Hamas doesn't come stronger or doesn't survive what happened since October 7th and doesn't utilize the pouring of cash and infrastructure projects to revive itself from the ashes again. And here comes the role of the Arab world. And I was talking to Faris about that. I think, to be honest, the Arab world has to go inside Gaza, find a way by a way or another, Egypt, the Saudis, the Emiratis, bring other Muslim nations into that, and try to do a campaign all across the Arab world and show that what Hamas has done to the Strip because of its irresponsible actions. So let's call it a defamation campaign to prepare the Arab world for Arabs entering the Gaza Strip and taking care of things. So because once they get into the Gaza Strip, I assume clashes are going to happen with the jihadist groups or terrorists residing inside the Strip. And obviously, some segments of people in the Arab world, especially the Muslim Brother-affiliated one, are going to capitalize on that, and they will try to defame, let's call them the moderate Arabs, you know, and defame them. See, they are filling the vacuum of Israel, and they are doing what Israel used to do. So we need preparations from nowadays, media-wise, and also plan-wise. How can we ensure that Hamas doesn't live, and then Muslim Brotherhood groups in the region don't capitalize or do not capitalize of Arab involvement in Gaza in order to defame Arab states and make them in embarrassed positions in front of their publics.
Before you go, Faris, I just want to make sure everyone's aware that there are note cards going around. Raise your hand with the note card if you've written your questions so that folks can come around. Okay, we got one here. Okay, great.
So just we had a great discussion before about this and what strategy could happen and what we can do in the day after in terms of Hamas. And I 100% agree. Like this, it's probably the major question that needs to be addressed. But on the idea of an Arab involvement in Gaza, I think I told you, I personally view it as something that will be catastrophic because in my mind, Palestinians would think that the Arabs just replaced, that basically we brought another occupier to replace the old occupier. You mentioned that there will be a lot of probably conflicts between the existing groups in Gaza, the jihadist groups. So to me, I know some Arab countries, I think 1 or 2 Arab countries, were open to the idea of sending troops in the Gaza Strip. But I honestly don't think if, in my opinion, this would be the wisest and the best strategy to do. The difference is Haisam has at least a plan and has a strategy. I don't have an alternative. So to me, it's just, I don't think it's a good idea, but I do appreciate and like that you at least have a strategy and have something, have a plan and answer to the question.
If I just may, in my humble opinion, I think, yes, let's call it, some Palestinians will resist Arab involvement, not all Palestinians. And some Palestinians who will resist, between parentheses, are going to be Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas sympathizer Palestinians who will reject Arab involvement because they got used to the old style that cash is giving to them. They dig tunnels and they do whatever they want and no censorship. Okay, but I'm sure that also there are some segments of Palestinians who are living inside Gaza learned the lesson and understood that surrendering the Gaza Strip and giving it to groups like Hamas will lead to destruction over and over and over again. And these are the constituents within Gazan society, and I would argue even inside the West Bank, the moderate Arab camp should be targeting and should try to make deals with them and should try to empower them. I think if we do it this way, I think we could have hopeful future for Gaza. But just surrendering and say Hamas has the upper hand and the Muslim Brotherhood over there or jihadist groups are controlling everything, and we don't want to roll our sleeves and go engage them directly because this is going to look bad, then in my humble opinion, then you're not sincere about, not you personally, in general, you're not sincere about really giving Palestinians the tough medicine in order to help them recover and ensure that October 7 doesn't happen again and the consequences of it doesn't happen again.
It strikes me that there's an alternative, though, between Hamas on one side, which obviously nobody wants to invest in a future Gaza Strip with Hamas in power because you will be funding a reconstruction of Gaza every 10 years, to be frank, and an Arab occupation of the Gaza Strip. It strikes me that there would be, I would hope, some kind of Palestinian governance that could, I would imagine, join forces. And
it's called
you
the
do
PA.
have, it's called the PA. And that is, how I would envision it. And you've seen that there are some countries, I think Jordan and Egypt months ago were mentioning they would be willing to invest boots in the ground, like you said, if the PA were brought into this. And it occurs to me that if the PA is somehow involved, you have a lot more buy-in and willingness from other Arab partners. I wonder if you agree.
I have an umbrella for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we have a lot of questions here. We're going to run through them, so be brief. First one, how realistic is the U.S. proposal of the Riviera Gaza? This is specifically, will this be acceptable to Saudis? We know it won't be to the Egyptians.
I don't think it's acceptable even to the Saudis. I don't think, I honestly think it's not a gimmick. I don't want to say it's a gimmick. It's just I don't think it's feasible. I don't think Saudi leadership would support it. It's just a speculation, in my opinion. To me, the idea of moving how many 2 million, 1.5 million in Gaza, depending on the estimations you look at, is just out of them, and then rebuilding the whole strip. It's not realistic. The idea of moving the whole because once those people, and I assume people in Gaza they do want a better life, and if they leave the strip and they do get better opportunities outside, they would rather stay. Obviously, I would rather stay outside of Gaza. I don't want to live there. It's just not. So to me, moving them out and rebuilding and creating a Riviera, on the Mediterranean, is just not feasible. And honestly, I don't know who would fund that. I don't know if actually Trump would commit to funding that. I just think and we've talked about it. Trump is making those remarks, in my opinion, just to kind of stir the pot. To get the Arabs going and maybe just get some action going and get the Arabs actually be more invested in the future of the Strip.
The next question is about the Palestinian cause. You mentioned that there is widespread support for Palestinians. What does that actually mean to Egyptians, to Jordanians, to Saudis, etc.? And it says, given that polls show a majority of Palestinians support Hamas, when you say that people support Palestinians, does that mean to you that they also support Hamas, or are they anti-Israel, or do they simply support Palestinian self-determination? And for you as well, Haisam.
So, great question, because there's a lot of nuances. Supporting or being even against, so the Arabs, I think, I was speaking for Saudi Arabia in my case. The way we view the Palestinians has nothing to do with the way we view Israel. It's very different. If we have problems or concerns with the Palestinians or with Hamas, that doesn't mean that the Saudi public is pro-Israel. So just to get this out of the way, because a lot of people think, like Saudi maybe don't support Hamas, they must be pro-Israel. No. With that said, before October 7, support for Hamas was really low in Saudi. You can look at, I think there was 1 or 2 polls showing, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think lower than a third had some positive views about Hamas. After October 7, support for Hamas had gone really up, I think 2/3 or even more. And it's not about Hamas itself. I don't think that Saudis have just suddenly realized, oh, like, let's support Hamas, we agree with their ideology. It's just about the pain and the suffering that it was inflicted on the Palestinians, and it leaves them no choice but to think, okay, whoever is fighting in the Strip, that's defending Palestinians, even though it was our mistake in the first place to actually a tragedy, a horrible day. So support for Palestinians and support for the Palestinian cause is there. So, the majority of Saudis would love to see a Palestinian state at some point, but also a lot are cynical and also skeptical about basically the Palestinian Authority's corruption, inability to actually govern, in the West Bank, and the division between Hamas and the Palestinian and Fatah and the other Palestinian factions. These are all just make support for Palestinians kind of something vague. Like, yes, we support the Palestinian cause, we support the Palestinian state, but we don't know, in my opinion, that's how I read it, we don't know which side. Like, we, of course, back the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority is not delivering. But again, support for Palestine doesn't mean support for Hamas. And support for Hamas after October 7, I think that's just temporary, just because of the conflict. And you see people realizing, like we don't agree, we don't see eye to eye, especially when it comes to the ideologies and the thinking on the conflict.
Yeah, I think Faris explained it very good. But one point I will just add that generally speaking, in the Arab world, when you talk about the question of Palestine, people cannot make a distinction between Hamas and other Palestinian factions. And I'm sure it will be surprising, but to your surprise, you will be surprised they really don't understand much about the intra-Palestinian dynamics. But after October 7th, I would argue that many people actually were sympathized because Palestinians in general or Gazans are Muslims, Arabs, speak the same language, so they were really surprised, they were really saddened to see them getting dragged into such conflict, especially in their eyes, Israel is the stronger side. But over the time, some questioning started to happen, and some talks, especially if you observe Arab social media or you analyze the writings of authors and writers over there, they will say, if you have a stronger neighbor like Israel, why do you go attack them and you cause all this destruction to them, and then you cry when things come back at you? Aren't you responsible for the people that you are ruling and under your leadership? Didn't you know that by doing that, the consequences are going to be as bad as that? So the point I'm trying to make is there is a realization in the Arab world that terror groups or militant groups, whenever they rule a territory in the Arab world, they drag their societies and the entire region to unintended, unthoughtful consequences. So now there is more appreciation to nation states ruling the countries and taking care of their societies, because at the end of the day, if there is a government and there is a military, it's going to be very, very responsible with its resources and its attitude toward its neighbors, compared to so-called resistance or militant or terror groups like Hamas. The idea pops in their mind, they just go and do it for some political games without taking into consideration the local public.
We have a lot of questions here on sort of the specifics, the contours of the day after strategy and reconstruction. And so I just want to name some of what's been mentioned already on this panel, which is media campaigns for de-radicalization against extremism. This is something that Saudi has a lot of experience doing, de-radicalizing extremism. So there are a lot of best practices that already do exist in the region. There is the military component, as you named, and essentially bringing boots on the ground from the Arab world into the Gaza Strip, potentially alongside the PA, as you mentioned. There are a lot of different formulations here, but I just want to name some of what's already been reflected on this panel, that there is a lot in common between what the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Americans even, other than the Riviera piece, have to say about this. So I just want to name that. But there are reasons to be optimistic and reasons to be less so, but there are a lot of best practices at play that I think the region has experience dealing with. Can I see your watch a second, Faris? 8 minutes. Okay, thank you. I should probably wear a watch when I moderate. Next question is on Iran, because Iran was in some ways the driving force between the normalization prospects between Saudi and Israel. So what is that still driving a lot of this? And I would think, it strikes me that Iran would be enough of a motivating factor to maybe get over the Palestinian piece, I would think. And we have that other point you made about Saudi-US normalization without Israel, which I'm curious what you think the Americans are getting out of that.
So on Iran, there's always this argument, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I don't think it's that simple in case, of course, there is a lot of agreement on Iran and its malign influence and its funding of proxies. But honestly, in 2021, when Israel was transferred from the Europe Command to CENTCOM, the Central Command, I think the need for direct Saudi-Israel relations doesn't exist anymore, because you have the United States coordinating between all its partners in the region to try to face Iranian influence. And so driving, again, you have, if there is any, now we're hearing talks about preventive action against Iranian nuclear weapon program, and just countering Iranian influence. The United States is the center, is the focal point, I think, and around it comes all the partners, Saudi, Israel, and other Arab states that have not normalized with Israel. So I don't think it drives really a lot of that anymore. And also, Saudi Arabia's deal with Iran in March 2023, when they normalized relations, sidelined the Iranian threat to Saudi Arabia to an extent. We've seen this with the Houthis. They've abided by the ceasefire to an extent. At least no more drones or missile attacks, cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia, the UAE as well. So Saudi have basically got itself out of that dilemma of having maybe to work at some point with Israel, even on a very, very, very tacit level, and not direct, through the U.S. and maybe just like a tacit understanding, got out of that dilemma and that problem by sidelining the Iranian threat, by normalizing relation with Iran, basically trying to settle all of these disagreements with Iran itself, so it doesn't have to be in that position. And your other second question?
I can't remember it anymore.
I'm sorry.
Haisam, can you talk to us about the blockade on the Egyptian side of the border? Because we obviously hear a lot about the Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip, but of course they share a border with Egypt. What role has Egypt been playing? Someone wanted to know when that actually started, and what role have tunnels underground into Egypt been playing in potentially fueling this conflict? Sorry to add on to that, but I've heard a lot of differing opinions, so I'm curious your take. To what extent has Egypt been turning a blind eye versus actually trying to crack down on weapons being smuggled into Gaza over the past 10 years or so?
Sure, I think it did both. But again, it goes back to the main idea I talked about. Egypt's role in the Middle East politics started to diminish in the past decade or so. So one way for Egypt to stay relevant in Middle East politics, it had to find some, let's call it, creative ways. And by looking at the Palestinian arena in the past 10 years, again, as I mentioned earlier, Egypt used to have the upper hand in managing the whole profile. But in the past 10 years, Turkey started to get into the relationship. The Qataris started to get into the relationship, and the Iranians as well. So the Egyptians found themselves that they have to compete with other regional partners in order to have an upper hand over Hamas in the conversation. So one of the things they started to do is they started to turn a blind eye to some of Hamas actions in order to still have a say over them, because they get the money from the Qataris, they have the ideological sympathy with the Turks, and also they house them and give them money, and the Iranians train them in Iraq and other parts of the region. So what did Egypt has to offer in the conversation? So I think here comes that some members of the Egyptian security establishment were corrupt ones, but under the nose of the regime knew about that, and they let Hamas smuggle some weapons. Maybe not smuggle the whole thing, because Israel is monitoring the situation, but still they let them to do what they did. Obviously, the blockade also was one of the cards they used to play. Whenever Hamas doesn't listen, they squeeze them and increase the severeness of the blockade. But at the end of the day, it was just a political game. They had to play it in order to stay relevant in the Palestinian arena, because they were having diminishing role in many regional conflicts, including the Palestinian arena.
Are there any other Faris, you'll tell me when my time is up. Are there any other? Oh, it is up? Oh, okay. Never mind. We're done here. It was great to be joined by both of you. Thank you so much. My only announcement is that if you have registered for the cohort program, please go up to the lobby floor, get a name tag, and then head up to the 8th floor for our dinner and discussion. And if everyone could allow those cohort folks to get out first, so if you're not in the cohort program, stay seated for another 20 seconds or so.
And we want to give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much.